Welcome to Facing the Future, brought to you by the Concord Coalition. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Well, if it seems to you that the U.S. is facing ballooning debt and difficult choices that need to be made against a backdrop of declining trust in government and a fractured, polarized media environment, the good news is we're not alone, if that's good news anyway. Recently, the Paris-based OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, released a report titled The People and the Budget: Empowering Public Understanding of Public Finances. And to discuss that report and also check in on how public finances here in the United States are going in Washington right now, is this week's guest, Bill Hoagland. He's Senior Vice President at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a frequent guest on this show. Bill has spent 33 years on Capitol Hill wading through the budget process, and most of which he spent as U.S. As a staff director on the Republican side of the U.S. Senate Budget Committee. In fact, he's the longest serving Republican Senate Budget Committee staff director in the history of the Budget Committee. And he later served as Director of Budget and Appropriations for Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist. And last month, he made the supreme sacrifice of jetting across to Paris to attend the OECD's release of this report and participate in a panel. So, Bill, welcome back to Facing the Future.
Thank you, Bob. It's good to be back with you.
I really really appreciated this report. The OECD really takes public engagement on the budget very, very seriously. So tell me a little bit just about your involvement with this report and what the conference was like.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, the OECD, as you mentioned, is a international forum. It's made up of about 38 countries that expand North America, South America, Europe, Asia Pacific. They had this conference here 2 weeks ago in Paris at their OECD headquarters. I will say that it was a very hot Paris. Every day was above 90 degrees, and Paris is not known to have air conditioning either. So, but the OECD offices are well equipped, and they did have air conditioning. I was asked to participate in the forum that they had on the people and the budget. And I was specifically asked to participate in a panel that was entitled Empowering Public Understanding, which is right up the road of what Concord Coalition is all about. They released the report that you mentioned, the people and the budget, the morning of the conference, which, by the way, included about over 500 representatives from, as I say, from North America, South America, Asia, Europe. Number of these were representatives from their finance offices, some from their parliaments, also some from their institutions similar to GAO and CBO. And so this is a broad sweeping group of individuals that are directly involved. And their whole focus was on, yes, we have these fiscal benchmarks that we want to hit, and we all, as you mentioned, Bob, the number of the countries have difficulties in terms of their debt and deficits. But the question was how to get the elected officials to respond to the challenges that lie ahead. And they came up with this report that you mentioned, which is a very good report, I think. I've gone through it a couple of times, but there were four pillars of that they focused on. The first was that we need to demystify the budget. We need to make it more understandable to the American public. Speaking of such things as debt to GDP, may be important for us budget geeks, but that doesn't really resonate to the individual out there that's affected. We need to communicate more clearly to the public was their second pillar. And I think that's something that you at Concord Coalition are working on all the time, but how to take all these difficult budget issues, some of the very technical, how to make that more saleable to the public. I will say that it was interesting that some of the more, let's say, Gen Z participants like to think about Instagram and other forms of TikTok and other ways of getting the message out as a way of better communicating than maybe the way some of us old budgeteers use old charts to go out. And then I think the big one, as it relates particularly of interest to Concord, was how to get the citizens more involved in the process. And while I gave a shout out, by the way, to Concord Coalition for that is what you do. And this idea of having representation out carrying on your fiscal tours, meeting with the public, meeting directly with them. I focused on my comments as what we need to do is we need to give the elected officials a spinal implant and that to deal with the difficult issues they have to do. As one of the leaders of the EU, the president of the EU likes to say, we know what we have to do. We just don't know how to get reelected if we do it. And that issue of how can we get the elected officials to make these hard decisions begins with getting the public to better understand what those issues are, what the ramifications of high debt and deficits are, how to translate that into real impacts that people have in terms of the interest payments on their loans or borrowing or putting down a payment on a house, all those issues that how to make it much more understandable. And then finally, their last pillar, the fourth pillar, was to empower what we call fiscal advocates. And this was where we're talking about organizations such as GAO, such as the Inspector General, such as as I say, GAO and CBO, how to strengthen those organizations and make sure that they remain independent, but also communicate directly. I was on a panel was led by, moderated by Gillian Tent of the Financial Times, a representative from Oxford University, a representative from the International Budget Partnerships, a representative from South Africa, and the young Gen Zs, if you like, the co-founders of a digital media exercise in Colombia. And that was the nature of the discussion. And I think it was enlightening and certainly, I believe, worth the time that it took to go over and get back.
Well, nobody will feel sorry for you with that air conditioning issue in Paris. But I thought the report was really was very, very good, and it made some points that have been around for a long time, but it put it in the context of the changing nature of the budget challenge. Those long-term issues that we talked about for so long back at the beginning of the Concord Coalition have arrived. I mean, we're getting these deep fiscal pressures, huge budget deficits, huge debt. And so the need for action is more urgent. And so they make that case that, public engagement is going to be really crucial. It's not just a good government thing. It's really endemic to getting stuff enacted.
One of the call outs from the report that I zeroed on, in fact, shared with Carolyn last week was a statement says engaging citizens is no longer just a public relations exercise. It is at the core of sound fiscal decision and essential for building a more responsive, effective, and efficient public institution. So I think they grasp it. It's you've got to engage the public. You have to have a good relationship with the public. And that's the only, and that seems to me, to be honest with you, from my perspective, and all the years, Bob, you and I have spent in this, laboring in these vineyards, you just can't go to the elected officials and say, do this, do that, unless you have the public backing. And that's the key here, it seems to me, to this report and what it's trying to do, and what Congo Coalition has been doing and wants to do, and continue to press forward.
That was one of the very first points that Paul Songus made when we were getting the Concord Coalition up and running was that, uh, he always told us that politicians are like weather vanes. They'll be sensitive to the wind direction. And you can't just go up to the barn and point to the weather vane and say, hey, would you point in the right direction? So he said, if we want to get something done, we can't just say what a good result is. We have to change the wind direction. And
Right.
that was the whole justification for, the grassroots movement. And this OECD report was kind of a verification or a validation
Yeah, definitely.
of all that. We're going to have to take our first break here, but we'll be right back after these short messages. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center. And we're talking about a new report by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, titled The People and the Budget, Empowering Public Understanding of Public Finances, which is pretty much what the Concord Coalition is all about. Bill was at a conference where the report was released in Paris last month at the OECD headquarters. Bill, some of the things that were in this report, just struck me as very, very familiar. One of them is the difficulty of communicating about big numbers. And I was just struck by that, kind of laid it all out, how, people have difficulty distinguishing between hundreds, billions, millions, trillions.
Right.
And this is a constant problem that we have. Did you talk about that, or did your panel deal with that subject at all?
A panel briefly touched upon those issues because in communicating with the public, getting out and meeting with the public, um, talking those grandiose big numbers, GDP, percentage of GDP, the debt to deficit, the size of the debt deficit, that just doesn't resonate with the average citizen out there. And so we talked about it in the context, how do you take these challenges and how do we make it more applicable to the day-to-day operations? We talked a lot about there are various ways of approaching this with the public. One of them is various models that we use. One model, of course, is the household model. You can't spend more than you take in. And we talked about that, but that really doesn't quite apply to a government. So then we talked about the issue of using it from the generational, and I think this is probably the biggest one. How we can't borrow anything we spend today, we're borrowing from our children's and grandchildren's future. This is pretty well acknowledged across the board for all these countries. But again, it's hard to communicate to tell people this is what's going to happen if we don't do something now. People don't want to focus on it, particularly when you're in the middle of high inflation right now and you're facing with just putting food on the table right now. How do you convince people that they should worry about the future, about their children and grandchildren? And of course, the third approach, which is some of these countries have gone through, is they can't do it. They don't, and they're not achieving, and end up in a crisis. And the crisis really then focuses the attention, and then they have to do something. I was struck by the fact that one of the panels included Greece, Portugal, Italy, and Ireland. And you might remember a few years ago that was those were called the pigs.
Yeah.
Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, I think, was part of it. And interestingly enough, Portugal, who went through that crisis, today is running surpluses. We don't want to get to what Portugal, Greece, and Ireland and others went through in Spain. But that unfortunately hangs out there as maybe that's where we're headed if we don't get back to dealing with this issue right away. And so communicating it in terms of what it means on your future income, interest rates, your ability to borrow, afford a car or a home or a mortgage. Somehow we need to take all our grandiose statistics that Bob, you and I use and make it understandable to that individual out there that this is a serious issue and you need to address it. And yes, it was something that was a major focus of the conference.
I was struck by one of they sort of gave an analogy or an example at one point that I thought was really interesting. They had a paragraph about how to explain something, and they said now experts would disagree with several ways. This is, use the phrase bankruptcy, and they say economists would say, well, a nation isn't technically going bankrupt, and so they shouldn't use that term. And I've had that argument, particularly about Social Security. And they said, there was another phrase that they would say, experts would, argue with this, that there's not really a crisis or whatever, whatever. And it was interesting because the way they were putting it in plain language, they were saying, we need to communicate in plain language. And basically they were saying, you experts need to just deal with this. Just
Yeah, right.
what it's telling is the story. It's
Yep.
communicating the story. And so in a technical sense, maybe there are caveats that an expert would disagree with. And that sort of debate happens all the time in our line of work, particularly when you're trying to communicate with the public. I have had this journey myself, just going from being a regular citizen who didn't know much about these issues. I was a lawyer. I was a staff attorney for an appellate court, and then I got involved in Paul Tsongas's presidential campaign. And over the last 35 years or so, have become something of I turned into a budget wonk.
I know, and a good one at that too.
And so I suffer from this language problem of now using making caveats about certain language, and that's part of the problem too. Is they said that experts use jargon. Um, all professionals, all whatever occupation you're in, you tend to use jargon, but that's like communicating in these huge numbers. It's the jargon, and we'll probably run into this later when we talk into what's going on Capitol Hill. We start talking about a reconciliation bill and whatever mandatory spending versus discretionary spending. But that's another problem that you and I probably suffer from.
I'm sure. I will say that there was one kind of broad overriding theme issue that transcends not just budgets, but broadly government. And that is that they kept making the point that effective fiscal communication is rooted in institutional credibility. And what has been pointed out is trust in government. And we suffer from that right now here in the United States, where a recent Pew survey found that we are at one of the lowest levels in terms of the public's trust in the credibility of government. Well, if you can't trust your government, you can't trust the numbers that the government is providing to you. And so that's broader than just what we're talking about here. That's how do we restore that trust in the institution of government? And that's a big issue. And that we didn't deal with it directly, but it does seem to be a real wet blanket that hangs over all this.
I think that's true. That was one of the things that I was struck about this report. It took me back 15 years or so because we did a number of focus groups, and they were these long, day-long activities that we did in conjunction with our fiscal wake-up tour. And people would go through these budget exercises, but not like a 2-hour thing. It was like an all-day sort of thing. It was a deliberative process. And the fundamental conclusion was people are willing to make hard choices if they're informed about the numbers, and they're willing to make compromises. But the big caveat was they did not trust the government to be
Yep.
able to make use of those hard choices. So people were willing to say, I'd pay more taxes if I had to, but I don't trust the government to spend them wisely, or I don't, my benefits need to be cut, so be it. I can see it as a compromise, but again, I don't trust the government. So I was struck by this report from OECD really making that point very strongly. That's why public engagement was so important, that these are programs that affect people. Because, the other problem is the fundamental driving issues behind these big deficits are programs that are very important to people, like Medicare, like Social Security. Taxes are important to everybody. And if it's just a matter of cutting a little waste, fraud, and abuse here and there, or taxing the rich, well, maybe you wouldn't need to engage the public, but we do need to engage the public.
Well, it's a good point, and I do think it's a maybe you and I are both, we don't want fraud, we don't want waste, we want abuse. But if a government, if that is the focus of the message, that's fraud, waste, and abuse, and we can do that, then and we should address those issues. But if that's all the focus, then it takes it away from what some of the more difficult challenges you don't have to deal with. The entitlement programs growing faster than the economy and creating the deficits that we have today. So we got a balancing act here between how we communicate fraud, waste, and abuse versus what is actually driving the bigger picture of debt and deficits.
You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We're talking about a new OECD report on engaging the public on hard choices. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some hard choices here at home with the appropriations process. We're going to get into some good budget jargon as we talk about our budget process and a update of the Social Security and Medicare Trustees report. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center and a 33-year veteran of Capitol Hill, working mostly with the Senate Budget Committee. Well, we're gonna come back from Paris now, talking about the OECD, and we're talking about how budgeteers use technical language and big numbers, and we're going to use some technical language and big numbers now to proving the point, to talk about some breaking news from Washington, which is the release of the annual Social Security and Medicare Trustees report. It's not huge breaking news in the short term anyway, because the numbers are pretty much the same as they were last year in terms of what everybody looks at first, which is the insolvency dates. It looks like the main Social Security trust, that looks like it's going to be insolvent in 2032. And without change, the across the board benefit cut would be 22%. That's pretty much the same as the trustees were projecting last year. It's actually a little bit worse than they were projecting last year. And then the Medicare HI trust fund is facing insolvency in 2033. That's about the same as it was last year, with a projected benefit cut of 11%, or provider reimbursement cut of 11% if they don't do anything at that point. So those are just a quick review of the numbers. Bill, what do you think?
Well, again, I'm not surprised. I don't think anybody should be surprised. This has been pretty well telegraphed for many, many years, that this issue of the trust fund solvencies, both on Social Security as well as the HI, the Medicare Trustees Medicare Fund, would deplete given the nature of expenditures and revenues coming in. So without having had an opportunity to review the actual report today, the one thing that stands out from what you've indicated, Bob, is that if it's 2032 or 2033, regardless, it could vary there. The next elected president, as well as the next Congress, in fact, senators that will be new senators that will be elected in 2027 and sworn in 2028. Basically, this will be on their watch. They will have to deal with it. So the one thing that I take away from this is it's getting closer and more difficult, and this is one that they cannot allow for it to those trust funds to deplete. I think if we're talking anywhere from 20% reduction in what people thought they were going to get in Social Security benefits, whatever the particular numbers translate into, that just will cannot stand. Something has to happen. And as it relates to the HI trust fund, what that means, let's be clear what that means. That means doctors and hospitals reimbursement rates will be reduced by 17, 18, 13%. Again, that just cannot happen. And something Congress has to address these issues. So without knowing exactly all the numbers here, I do think it does indicate that the issues are now going to be front and center for the next president. I guess I'd be surprised to see anything happen in the remaining of this Congress or even the next Congress, but this is going to be a major issue. And by the way, now that I think about it, will probably have to be a major issue during the presidential campaigns coming up in 2028.
Well, if the Concord Coalition has anything to say about it, they will be.
That's
I
good.
I think that yes, I mean because this is very relevant to what we were talking about before with the OECD report because you have these programs that need attention, and it's not just the internal bookkeeping of Social Security, which is what we're talking about here with the trustees report. It is very vital to the budget as well. I mean, paying off the bonds in the trust fund, even before you get to insolvency, is a budgetary cost. So
That's right. That's a good point.
it has a big cost, and of course, on Medicare, it's even bigger because the Medicare Part B, that's the physicians, and the Part D, the prescription drugs. Um, that's got a huge general revenue subsidy. I mean, 75% of the cost of the other Medicare, Part B of Medicare is
Part B.
yeah is paid out of general tax revenue. It's not it's not covered by the premiums that we seniors pay. I mean, about 25% of it is paid for that way, but people don't realize what a heavily subsidized program Medicare is, and the cash deficits on Social Security even before trust fund solvency. So it's really two problems. They're endemic to the programs themselves for their own financing, but they're also a drain on the federal budget.
Correct.
Um, okay, so speaking of the federal budget, we've got there's actually a federal budget process sort of going on right now. I don't know that we really have a federal budget process anymore. It's really strange. I mean, what's going on right now, and this will lapse into the next segment, but there's where do you want to begin with it, Bill? We're supposed to be doing appropriations for fiscal year 2027, and that's not really what's happening.
Well, if you want to, we'll deal with appropriations for 2027 beginning in October. Um, yes, we do not have much progress to report here, except for the fact that the House of Representatives has passed one of the 12 appropriation bills required for funding fiscal year. The House has passed. Um, they have approved eight uh, of the bills of the 12 in their full committee. And literally, as we speak, they are marking up the Health and Human Services major bill. What 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 I think is happening here is the House is moving uh, and can do that because they are what they are, I guess. They can force this. But I want to make it clear, absolutely nothing is happening in the United States Senate. Zero. They have delayed their markups. As we know, the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committees is Susan Collins, who's in a senatorial race this year. They can't even agree in the United States Senate what the top line should be for funding for fiscal year 27. So I know I get accused of being a doom and gloomer, but I don't see in this very politically charged environment, plus the possibility of one of the chambers switching or both switching, that we're going to be able to come to an agreement on this portion of the federal budget, which is the 27 appropriation level, which only makes up, as you know, 30% of all spending anyway. So I guess I'm suggesting that we're looking at again at another, maybe a continuing resolution, or the worst, possibly another government shutdown right before the elections. I doubt elected officials want to go through a shutdown before midterm elections. But the point being, we are not making progress at all on the appropriations process. The House would say they're moving, but if the Senate is not moving at all, it's you can't guarantee any outcome here that suggests that we'll have an agreement on the level of funding for fiscal year 27. And finally, I will simply say that we have the issue of we don't even have a budget for fiscal year 27. We should have adopted that by now. And there is a discussion of another budget resolution, but that also seems to be starting to dim rather clearly.
And we'll get to that dimming picture on the other side of the break. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center. And we'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking to Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center. And we're talking about what remains of the budget process in Washington. Okay, so we talked about the appropriations process, that there's really nothing going on at this point, particularly in the United States Senate. The Senate has passed a reconciliation bill. I apologize for lapsing into jargon, but this is that special sort of fast track procedure that avoids a Senate filibuster. It's the process they used for the big tax cut last year. The interesting thing about this is that they're using it not for deficit reduction, not for revenues or mandatory spending, the entitlement programs. They're using it as a backdoor way to fund appropriations, which is the Homeland Security process. Bill, what do you make of this as a longtime appropriator on the Hill?
Well, first of all, as a member of the Budget Committee as opposed to the Appropriations Committee staff, I find that what Congress has done is to completely annihilate the budget process from what its original purposes was. When we think about what the 1974 Congressional Budget Impoundment Control Act was meant to do, it was meant to put some guidelines and direction on reducing debt and deficits going forward. And the use of putting together a blueprint, first of all, a budget resolution that says total amount of spending, total amount of revenues, some guidelines as to where we want to go. We don't have those today. So we don't have a budget resolution for fiscal year 27 is coming up. And when we do pass budget resolutions, as we did for fiscal year 26, we do it for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to generate an opportunity to get around the Senate filibuster. Not and in this particular case, what I find extremely disappointing is that Robert Byrd, the longtime author and part author of the Budget Act, would be astonished that we're using this budget reconciliation process to appropriate money, direct spending in appropriations. The budget, again, we're in the jargon here. I apologize to your listeners and all this, but we are now using this process to increase spending, not decrease spending, or to cut taxes, not raise taxes to address the debt and deficit. And we understand, we're not naive. We understand why Republicans are using this process because it allows them to avoid the 60 vote hurdle that they ran into with trying to pass a Homeland Security appropriation bill. But the idea that you can use reconciliation to fund something that is normally subject to appropriation, to fund these ICE and Border Patrol for 3 years is just unbelievable the way they have uh, made the process completely unacceptable, at least for us who believe that we should use the process for controlling debt and deficits going forward. I'm an old timer on this. I realize that time has passed me by, maybe, but this is not the way the process is supposed to work. And I think it reflects in some way the degree of partisanship and the divisions that exist in this country. When you have the very narrow margins that we have, I can understand why the party in control would go down the route of saying, well, we can get around the filibuster in the United States Senate and appropriate money that goes forward. I will also make a quick observation. When you do this, you're undermining the appropriation process. Um, uh, when you go through the appropriation process, which is normally it can be a bipartisan action, and coming from the Bipartisan Policy Center, no surprise, I want bipartisanship. If you put appropriation bills together, you got to work them out. You got to work out the decisions between the right and the left and the Republicans and the Democrats. And if you don't go through the appropriation process, you don't have a report. You don't have guidance. You don't have language to the agencies, in which case you're passing basically a blank check to the administration. And here again, we're undercutting Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution that makes it very clear that Congress should have the power of the purse. But I think we're weakening that whole process by the nature of what they're doing here. The Senate, as you said, Bob, passed their reconciliation bill last week. That was based upon a fiscal year 26 a budget resolution. We don't have a 27 budget resolution, so people talking about third reconciliation bill, we got a long way to go and only a few days left in this Congress. So I am pessimistic that there will be a third, as people like to talk, a third reconciliation bill, because we just don't have, given the politics and moving into the election season, this is going to likely end up with no budget resolution going forward for fiscal year 27. And once again, the process having been seriously undercut, particularly on the appropriation process.
Well, let me throw some fuel on the fire here. But I think it undermining is putting it mildly. It may be the death of it. It's here's the problem that I can foresee is that there's going to be a Democratic president someday and a Democratic Congress. And are we just setting up a situation where people just don't why go through the appropriations process? Because if you said one side has broken it, and why shouldn't the other side want to just get their priorities through a reconciliation bill? And we're seeing the creep forward now with this because if there is this reconciliation three that they talk about, it would be for defense spending, which is also an appropriated program. And the president has proposed a huge increase
Right.
for defense spending, and it's got all of those deficiencies that you're talking about, which is lack of specification, just a lot of big numbers. Um, is this? I mean, what what are the dangers of now funding defense through appropriations? It's just,
Yeah. And think about it. It's to your point. If you not taking sides here, but if you're a Democrat, if you have a Democratic controlled Congress and a Democrat in the White House, then why wouldn't you then do the Health and Human Services, the very large spending bill for all the social service? Why wouldn't you just do that through reconciliation as opposed to working out agreements between Republicans and Democrats? And so be careful what you wish for. This would, if anything, this is a process that I think has the potential for worsening our debt and deficits going forward, not as the initial intention of the Budget Act was to reduce our debt and deficits in a reasonable and responsive way.
if there is no reconciliation point three, I mean, what I mean, you are skeptical that there's going to be one just because it would be very difficult and there's running out of time.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be really difficult because, as you said, the administration would like to have a $1.5 trillion defense budget, and the regular appropriation process is about at least the House marking up, and here we're getting into the weeds. They're going to mark up later this week the defense appropriation bill, but it's be for 1.1, and they're going to expect then the remainder of that's going to come through reconciliation. Well, I don't know. We haven't seen the supplemental request exactly from the administration, but the longer this war goes on in Iran, in fairness, we need to support the troops. We need to make sure that we have national security. And so I don't know how this is going to turn out. There just has to be some solution to it that maintains our national security going forward. But I can tell you right now, everything I understand, the Democrats in the Senate are saying no way to a 1.5 trillion. And so we're going to have to find, at the end of the day, some negotiated settlement here, or we're going to be faced with what I think is likely just a continuing resolution. And somehow we're going to have to manage under that level of funding, which is the 26 funding level.
Do you think that what they would do is just declare what would otherwise be a war supplemental, put that in reconciliation and try to do that?
They could very well do that, Bob. Very well.
That would be going even another step further.
Yeah.
Um, Bill, we're gonna have to leave it there. But I do think that there's at least, some optimism in that OECD report
Yeah.
of
Yes.
people, recognizing that the public needs to be engaged in these issues. And if we can get beyond the jargon that folks like you and I use,
Yeah.
I think that that's because the public needs to be involved in all that we were just talking about now about these appropriations, because something fundamentally is happening here with shifting the constitutional burden of taxing and spending,
That's
and
right.
the public is not having a say in what, not even aware of what's going on. So
Yeah.
anyway, Bill, as always, I appreciate your coming on the show and enlightening us. And to the listeners, you've been listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I have been talking with Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'll be back next week with another edition of Facing the Future.